Well, thank you so much for everybody that's tuning in for the FFAW webinar series. Today we have Linda Behnken here. Linda is all the way from Alaska, and she's going to be talking to us about what her organization has been doing, especially with young harvesters, which is an area that we continue to try and focus on. So thank you so much, Linda, for being here virtually.
Well, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So Linda, could you just tell us, I guess, kind of about the Alaskan Longliners Association and work that you folks have been doing to get more young harvesters involved and support them, I guess, once they do get involved?
Sure. Yeah. So our organization's the Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association, and we're based in Sitka, Alaska, but we have members from 18 different coastal communities in Alaska, as well as some members who live in the lower 48. And the organization was started in 1978 with a real focus on making the fisheries Alaska fisheries. At that point, there was a lot of foreign investment or foreign activity harvesting fish off the coast of Alaska. And as those foreign fisheries were sort of moved out and the fish were made available to US fishermen, the first basis for those fisheries coming up to Alaska was more out of Canada or, but particularly the lower 48 of the US, so Seattle area. And the people who started the organization really wanted to see Alaska's communities benefit from the fisheries. So that was really our roots, with a lot of interest in promoting fishing opportunity, marketing opportunity for Alaskans. And I took over the association. I think I was the third or fourth executive director, and took over the association in the 90s. So went through our first big effort was to get this area closed to trawling as a way to promote the small community-based fishing boats that rely in this area. There are no trawlers based in Southeast Alaska, but again, they would come up from the factory boats would come up from the lower 48 on their way to the Bering Sea and do a couple tows. And the first year I took over running the association, in a couple tows, they shut down our local fishery for the rest of the year. And that was in the early spring. So we started a campaign, took quite a few years, but got this area closed. Which has really given us I think a lot of empowerment to do our best to take care of this area, to safeguard these resources, and to work hard to keep people from these communities actively involved. But we did start noticing about, 10 years ago, the real sort of shift in less young people seeing fishing as a viable opportunity. And because the cost of entry were so high, and also especially less young people entering the fisheries from our more remote and particularly indigenous communities, as less people in those communities were engaged in the fisheries, young people wouldn't see that as an opportunity. So real aging of the fleet. And we launched a number of programs to try to address that. We started a fishery conservation network to help our fishermen share information, work together to identify conservation issues with an eye to finding solutions that make them better at what they do, and also better at taking care of the resource. And just to give you a couple examples of that, we helped our fishermen get set up with the hardware and software, electronic technology to map the seafloor. And then, with relatively low cost kind of instrumentation, and then collected that data from our members and compiled it into a file that we could then give back to our members. So instead of it taking a young fisherman, 30 years to really have a good map of what the seafloor looks like and where the corals are you want to avoid, and where the good sort of bottom habitat is for halibut that you want to find. They could get that in a couple of years of sharing their data and getting data from a whole lot of other fishermen. And that all sounds easy. It actually took us about 3 or 4 years before the program crashed as soon as we put too many people's data together. But anyway, we got there eventually, and we now have our fishermen have the best bathymetric maps of the Gulf of Alaska, and the scientists actually borrow our maps under a non-disclosure agreement to use them for their stack assessment process. So it's been a really good sort of back and forth exchange where we've informed the science and it's helped our fishermen be better at what they do. They have flagged areas of high bycatch of rockfish, for example, which is a really long-lived, probably as you know, species that's easy to overfish and slow to recover if it is overfished. So flag those high bycatch areas, help young people avoid them, share data. We've worked on a number of other projects like that through our network, and there's a lot of information on our website people can look at for our fishery conservation network. Then some of the other programs, we started a crew apprentice program to help young people get that first job in fisheries and to try to make sure their first time experience going out fishing, they're well informed about what to expect. They've protected their interest through a contract that we're putting them on boats that we've carefully vetted and sort of trained to have the focus be on safety and learning with skippers who are selected based on the recommendation of other skippers and their past crew to be calm in a crisis and good at sort of teaching. And that's been a really successful program. We've run over 40 people through it. Some of them are fishing every summer. Some of them have bought their own boats. And some have gone into more fisheries management with a new understanding of what it's like to be out on the water to guide them. And some will just forever have a better appreciation for the fish they buy at a grocery store. And we think all of that's a win. And over half of the people we have got out, young people, are women. And that's another aspect of the program that has made me,
especially where though we are on different ends of the continent, there are a lot of the same issues that we're facing here in Newfoundland and Labrador, especially with the graying of the fleet. And we have a campaign currently which is to end corporate concentration in our inshore fishery, because of having these large processing companies that are able to really take control of our resource and really impact the vitality of the inshore fishery. And I know that in the United States, they recently passed a Young Fishermen's Act. So could you tell us a little bit about that act? And maybe, I know these things never happen overnight, maybe the process of getting to that act, which I'm sure was many, many years of hard work, but, and maybe what you folks hope to see with that act, because we know it's just, acts are great, but they're only one piece of the bigger puzzle.
Sure. Yeah. Probably 6 years ago, we started looking for USDA, which is United States Department of Agriculture, funding to support some of our young fishermen work and some of our work to promote local foods through our community supportive fisheries program. And discovered that there's federal funding in the US to support young people going into farming or in ranching and even fish farming, but not people going into wild capture fisheries. So USDA said, sorry, we don't have any programs that you would qualify for. So we thought we had to change that. And we worked with a coalition of other community-based fishing groups. So we have a national coalition called the Fishing Communities Coalition. And really that was the group that flagged this issue and that worked with Congress, to draft the legislative language and ask our Congress, our representatives, senators to move that language forward. And Alaskan, our senators actually played a huge role in that, and as did our congressman in introducing it, championing it through Congress. And it passed, surprisingly, because not much else passed in the past 4 years. But in December of 2020, the funding mechanism we had included in the bill was that the program be funded with $2 million annually taken from something called the Asset Forfeiture Fund, which is where funds are put when fishermen break a law and have to pay a fine, a fishing law and have to pay a fine, and that the money would be run through the Alaska Sea Grant program, which I don't know if you have something similar, but a Sea Grant does a lot of education, training for coastal people all around the country. So it would go to the regional sea grants. The regional sea grants would offer a run an RFP, a request for proposals, say, here's a grant opportunity, this is what you need to do with the money. And tribes, nonprofits, education groups can apply to operate a training and education for young fishermen. So it doesn't cover purchasing and permits or quota. It's training and education is what the Young Fishermen's Development Act is designed to do. So that bill made it through Congress, and now we are working to get funding appropriated to it, but we feel pretty confident. There was so much support for the act that appropriation, $2 million is not a big amount in the federal appropriation game. So we're hoping that amount comes through. And I believe the program for farmers and ranchers is more like, 20 million a year. So it seems like a pretty reasonable ask.
Yeah, definitely. So, Linda, a lot of the work that you've done over the past, 5 to 10 years, what are some themes that you've noticed, and maybe those themes are changing, the young harvesters say why it's hard to get involved? Because I would hazard a guess that they're probably very similar to what young harvesters are saying in Canada, but what are the barriers to getting involved in the fishery?
Well, certainly the high cost is the big one, the huge amount of risk you have to take if you're in your 20s and you're looking at taking on, hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, knowing that fishery prices fluctuate, quotas fluctuate, that's sort of a big risk to take when you're that age. So we structure our local fish fund that the amount down is only 10% of the asset. The asset secures the loan, and the payments are based on what people make from fishing. So they, rather than some fixed amount that could end up being a lot higher than what they're making. So we shielded our borrowers' risk to that 10% down. That's really all they have at risk. But that's a big one. And I think that's the main one to address. And then of course, just always the uncertainties that climate change is hitting Alaska super hard, as I'm sure it is in your region, where we're seeing a lot of stress on particularly our salmon runs right now. But there are always uncertainties in fishing. There's always the threat of fish farms or offshore oil and gas or offshore winds or all kinds of development issues. But I think climate change on top of that, it's that risk. But then I guess it definitely has a sort of snowball effect. If you start to lose, if you have a smaller fleet and limited entry, all these permit kind of programs reduce the size of the fleet. And so when there's less platforms to fish on, there's less places for young people to get started. And so they don't see it so much as an opportunity. And then you have less people involved, so then you have less push to keep the fleet and to have regulations that support a relatively large, diverse fleet based in the communities. I mean, that's sort of the snowball we'd like to roll back the other way. Yeah,
definitely. And I think that's certainly what we face a lot is the high cost of entry, and of course, as license prices go up, as the value of stocks go up, because we actually have some very high value species here. It's even harder to enter, and we're also dealing with, at the provincial level, having an aging population anyway. So it's like all sectors are facing it. It just seems more acute in the fishery. So it's something that we're always trying to think of different ways to approach it. And the loan program is, really interesting for us. We've been pushing our provincial government to get a different sort of loan guarantee program to help the harvesters. So it's always good to hear of it working in other places. I think just one final, question, Linda, before I won't take up too much more of your time, is what do you think the next 10 years will look like? Which is a tough one, but in terms of getting, young harvesters in, or what are some of the challenges? I know climate change was mentioned, but I guess what you see the next 10 years hopefully looking like with the success of these programs.
Well, I feel like we really are at a tipping point where our country, finally has an administration that's ready to move on climate change. I hope they're ready to move fast enough and far enough. They've also initiated a policy to conserve 30% of US waters and lands without being too clear about what conserve means, but we have really pushed that incorporate fishing communities, stakeholders, think about promoting sustainable fisheries. So we're really looking to try and build that into our government's approach to say, yeah, this is the chance to draw some lines between sustainable and unsustainable kinds of fishing, to be really tough on the kind of fishing, whether it's national or international, that's not sustainable and that's undermining the health of the resource, and to use it to promote opportunities for our community-based fishermen who are so committed, so important to local economies, local food security, sort of heightened understanding of that, I think, now because of the pandemic. And really also always have been stewards of the resource and advocates for keeping the local fisheries sustainable. I mean, they're the people who want to hand something to the next generation rather than make a profit and move on. So I'm hopeful. I mean, we don't have a great pro small boat administration in Alaska right now, but we're see some real hope in our federal system and trying to build that on this opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. It's always hard to look into that crystal ball, which is what we often say. It's like, we don't have a crystal ball. If we did, we would have probably, a lot of things would have been done differently. But certainly setting up programs like are happening in Alaska is something that we like to turn to. As I think I mentioned in our last calendar, there's the Blue Economy Strategy, which is being talked about in Canada right now, which is a federal strategy that's supposed to touch on all these different things, and we are focusing on coastal communities because in Newfoundland and Labrador, that's a lot of our members are living in these coastal communities that the fishery is the lifeblood of those communities, and without a strong fishery for years to come, those communities are really under threat. So we want to protect them. In protecting a strong fishery, you protect the community. So that's where our aim is headed as well. So
all of our materials, like our curriculum for our young fishermen or our host skippers, we're happy to share any information on local fish funds, happy to share, happy to help. You guys set up a program, love to come to Labrador. So,
yeah, that'd be awesome.
So yeah, just consider us a resource. And I think the more we do all around the world to help community-based fisheries helps all of us. So
yes, and I will be sure to include all of those links in our videos on our YouTube and our Facebook and our Twitter, which is where we share our webinar. So I'll make sure to get those links from you, Linda, so we can include them. And thank you very much for your time today.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you. Have a great day.